In this lecture, we're going to be talking a little bit about the state. And this is a big concept. It's really kind of a difficult thing to get at, especially for students for the first time. So I want to really help us think about this. And you might be asking yourself, why are we worrying about concepts that seem a little abstract, like the state or the nation or these other kinds of things that we're talking about? Well, the answer is important. Because imagine I told you, I said, look, what we're going to need to go do is understand how to take apart a car. And I said, okay, the best way to learn how to do this is let's take apart the car. So, okay, we're going to take it apart. Well, how? And that is kind of the conundrum that we find ourselves in political science. So we want to take apart countries, and we want to understand why they behave the way they do. How? Well, we need to understand the tools. So if you're trying to understand a car, we might want to understand things like how does a wrench work? And how do different kinds of wrenches work? And how do these kind of specialized computer tools tell us things about the engine, etc. And then pretty soon, by understanding this, you're going to be learning about how to take the car apart. That's the same way it's going to happen in comparative government. It's the same way it's going to happen here. And so one of the tools in our belt is going to be this concept, the state. But we need to understand the state, right? What is it and how do we use it? And that's what we're going to be dealing with here. We're going to be trying to understand what a state is. And this is specifically a difficult task intellectually for us here in the United States because we have all of these things all over the country called states, right? But what we're talking about as a concept here is not that, right? So I know that Florida is a state, Ohio is a state, Colorado is a state, Texas is a state, all these, but they're states. But not the way we're thinking about it here. Because what those actually are sub-governmental units. And that's a version of a way you can distribute power inside of a state, but it's not the only way. So what we need to kind of figure out is what is the state thing? And one of the things that you're going to have read and that we're going to be talking a lot about is a guy named Max Weber. And Weber is actually going to have an answer to this question. He is going to argue that a state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. So what Weber is basically arguing is that the organization that maintains a monopoly of violence over territory is a state. Now, you're probably wondering, how do you get Weber out of Weber? The answer is that Max Weber is actually German, and so that W is V. It's a V. It's a Weber. And this also might seem a little bit kind of jarring to you, right? So, wait, a state's all about force? It's about making me do things? Well, yes. At base, a state is going to be this institution, this bundle of institutions that we're going to see in a minute, that we accept as being legitimate to force us to do things. So, for instance, you probably don't question the fact that the police are allowed to, I don't know, arrest people. You probably can't even envision a community in which there's not some kind of force that prevents kind of chaos from happening, right? That's kind of usually the base fear for most people is there's going to be chaos happening at the ground level. Or imagine it from the outside, right? We need to have some kind of force that protects us from international invaders. But notice in all of these conceptions, what we're thinking about is some kind of force object. We're talking about something that has physical force. It has the monopoly of control over physical force in a given area. And even as a matter of fact, when you start thinking about, say, like something like a civil war, what we're talking about is, what we're talking about is this breakup between, okay, this monopoly. So if there's multiple actors who believe that they have the legitimate right to physical force, now you're talking about a situation of potential civil war. So at base, when we're saying that a state has a monopoly to the claim of violence in a territory, what we're saying is that state has sovereignty. And sovereignty, as I've already alluded to in my examples, is the ability to carry out actions and policies within a territory independently from external actors or internal rivals. Now, this means that we have to think about the state as the primary authority that is able to kind of tell people what to do there and to prevent other institutions from coming in and usurping that position. So that's what we mean by internal, external. So internally, so for instance, if I say to you, look, who wants to go and overthrow the governor? And then maybe lots of people don't like the particular government, but most people aren't going to probably say, yeah, let's go overthrow the governor of our particular state. Why? Well, one reason why is we accept them as legitimate. And that means that internally, right here, at least in the United States, there aren't very many internal rivals. Likewise, this means that if you have sovereignty, the external actors cannot force you to do what you're going to do. So states have a monopoly of control over violence, which means that they have sovereignty. But states also are composed of some really important things. They are, in fact, an institution, and we've talked about institutions. So this means that it is a set of ways that things work. But it's also composed of institutions. So let's think about the United States. We're going to start getting away from that, but I'm going to use some of our local examples to start with. What is the state? Well, the United States is composed of a president, a Congress, courts. Even inside of Congress, you have a House of Representatives and a Senate. You have all these different kinds of things. Those are also institutions. So states are an institution, but they are also composed of institutions. And what these institutions are trying to do is to turn some kind of political ideas into policy using that status as a monopoly force in a given territory. So you might want to think of states as kind of a bundle of institutions that are an important causal variable in things like, okay, economic development or democracy. Now, related to the state are a couple of other key terms that we're going to have to understand if we want to figure out what states do and are. And the first one we're going to take a look at is a thing called a regime. And a regime concerns the fundamental rules and norms of politics. They embody the long-term goals regarding individual freedom, equality, and power. So regimes are things that cannot be easily changed, but they're going to be more flexible than states. And so typically we think of a regime on this kind of democracy authoritarian spectrum. So on one side you have democracy, and on the other side you have authoritarianism. And this is kind of our view of the regime. Now regimes, you can imagine regimes shifting, but most people can't imagine it as state shifting. So that's why we think of this being a little more flexible. So imagine, if you want, that the state is kind of the machinery of politics. It's the computer. And you can think of the regime as the software or the programming that defines the capabilities of that computer. So you can have an identical computer, right? So you could have an iMac sitting in front of you. And it could be running Windows, and that's going to make it run one particular way. You could have it running Linux, and that's going to have it running one particular way. Or you can have it running its native OS X. The state hasn't changed, right? The state is the hardware of that iMac. It's that kind of screen, it's that hard drive, it's that processor, it's that memory, etc. And then the regime is going to be the software programming and how that computer should be carried out. Right? Now, our next term related to these is something called government. Now, this is difficult for us because in our case, in the United States, usually a multiplicity of people control government, not just one set of people or persons. So that means this is government. And so government is the leadership, excuse me, or the elite in charge of running the state. So going back to our analogy, that would make government kind of the operator of the computer. So if you have the iMac, it's got an operating system, which is the regime. The operator of the computer is government. So if you have a president, the person who is the president could be government. But the presidency is part of that bundle of institutions that is the state. And it's the most weakly institutionalized, meaning that we can envision governments changing, right? That doesn't surprise us at all. We have new elections and somebody else comes into office. That's government. We're used to that. That seems very normal. And if we want to kind of map out this relationship, we can kind of think of that like this, like a little pyramid, right? The most institutionalized thing that we have is the state, that machinery of that machinery of government. And then we have the regime, which is the programming, and then we have the government, which is that operator. Now, no one can imagine the state not existing. We can imagine, although it's more difficult, thinking about the regime shifting. So we can think about moving from being more dictatorial to more democratic or vice versa. And then governments are obviously the most weakly institutionalized of all. So no one thinks it's odd if and when we elect a new government, right? Or the government might change hands from one party to another party. Then we have one last word, and this gets thrown around a lot. We need to talk about it a little bit, and that's country. And country is just the shorthand that refers to the government, the regime, the state, the people, the nation, the geography, all of those things. That's the country. It's really a shorthand word, and so in this class, we're going to try to be more technical, and sometimes I'll be talking about the country doing this or that. But really, we want to say, okay, what is the state doing? What is the nation here? What is the regime here? How is society? So how do we end up with states, though? Because for most of us, we kind of picture a map and a globe covered in states, right? Who hasn't gotten the first globe and looked around, right? Man, basically the whole Earth is covered in states, and now even parts of space are being claimed by different states. But this has not always been the case. As a matter of fact, prior to the state, there have been a variety of political systems, but all of these are eventually going to be consumed by the coming of the state. And the beginning of stateness actually starts in Europe with the fall of the Roman Empire, which is really one of the last major non-states in the world. So Rome is going to end up getting sacked in 5 AD, and the aftermath is going to find that many local leaders are going to dominate politically. And this era of local leader domination is what we now call the Dark Ages, and it lasts from 5 ADE till about 1000 ADE. But why, out of all of these crisscrossing of old political forms, do we end up with this thing called the state? Well, there's a guy who tries to answer this question, and his name is Charles Tilly. And he tries to explain, he's a political scientist who's trying to explain why the state evolutionarily would emerge to be such a successful form that really the whole Earth ends up using it, which is a really a unique and unusual thing. So every kind of people all around the world end up eventually having some version of a state. That's a fascinating social science question. So Tilly's going to argue that out of this fractured, highly unstable, and sometimes violent political environment that we call the Dark Ages, that the state was a reaction to this disorder, and that the state is a order reaction to a disorder of the Dark Ages, and that as a matter of fact that there are these kind of three big categories of advantages that states have over the non-states that came before them. And the first is that states encourage economic development. Property in the Dark Ages tended to be monopolized. So warlords owned property and forced peasants to work, and this is a really poor economic condition. As a matter of fact, individuals don't have really any reason at the peasant level to innovate, create, produce, or think, because they don't get anything out of this. Peasants, by default in the Dark Ages, are kind of a piece of the land, right? Don't think slavery like the American context, but imagine like it's like the tree growing on the land. The peasant is a piece of this property. And so because these people are kind of a piece of the property, they don't have private property. And so why would they want to make their lives more efficient? Because what that only does is benefit the person who owns the land and not them. With states, there begins to have this idea of private property, and this is going to lead to economic development. Now, economic development is going to end up leading to two, which is encouraging technological development. So states interested in increasing their own economic and military power are going to see the importance of technology, and therefore this is going to combine with private commerce to create an era where technological development is actually something useful. And so technological innovation is going to be harnessed to dramatically change as a means of expanding power. But as a side benefit, it increases common everyday people's access to technology, and this leads to states beating out over other kinds of advantages. And so, for instance, Europeans conquered the world in large part because of some technological developments: gunpowder, advanced mathematics, modern map making, astronomy. These are actually going to all originate in other parts of the world. None of these advances actually happen in Europe. Yet it's Europe who will use these innovations in order to conquer most of the world, especially in the case of the United Kingdom. The reason that Europeans can absorb and use these, in large part, is because of their adaptation of state. Finally, and third, Tilly is going to argue that domestic stability results as a homogenization of peoples. homogenization. I know it's a big word, but basically what it means is it's making people more alike, right? When people are peasants and they cannot easily or freely move from property, it means that you have these little bubbles, these tiny little locations, and as a result, you have these very small language reaches. You don't know very many people on a large scale. But as states begin to emerge, people can begin to move further, far further than they ever had before. In some cases, nobody was moving further than just miles from their birthplace. And then suddenly you can move all the way through the state. And then as this happens, you have the development of kind of unified languages, which allows for printed documentation. And this develops to a shared culture. So shared language, shared culture, and so people begin to see themselves as belonging to common ethnic identities and comprising shared cultural values. And this leads to another advantage of the state. Now, states are ultimately going to win out as a result of the Treaty of Westphalia. Now, what happens is about as late as 1500 AD, only approximately 20% of the globe is going to be covered by states, but this will soon change as the states of Europe continue to advance economically and militarily. The capacity of the state to enlarge itself becomes possible. And so really one of the last big powers against state dominance in Europe at least is the Catholic Church headed by the Pope. And the Pope during this era is going to have a large degree of control over states by being able to have a threat of excommunication. In other words, these locations aren't going to be allowed to take communion. Now, there is a really profound and important war called the 30 Years' War. It lasts from 1618 to 1648. And in large part, it's a struggle between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. And we're not really so much interested in that, is that its outcome. Because the 30 Years' War culminates with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Now, importantly for our purposes, this document creates a singular source of authority that's going to be recognized, and that is state sovereignty is now decided to be the only authority, and other sources of authority, including things like papal authority, is completely curtailed by the document. And as a result, political scientists, most of them, are going to argue that the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 is the birth of the modern state system. And so really the last major non-state actor, the Catholic Church, is going to be eliminated. I don't mean eliminated as a religion, but eliminated as a political power. And the modern state, as you guys understand it, was going to emerge. And keep in mind, this is a European phenomena. So it's going to head other places once it happens in Europe. So now we can have an idea what this kind of state thing might be. We can understand where it comes from. Now we got to ask ourselves, okay, so how can we measure it? What are some of the things that will allow us to understand, okay, this state obviously is different from this other state. So what are some measurable, what's some variables that we can have on the state? And one of the first big ones is legitimacy. States, if we take a look at this process, actually come out of a somewhat arbitrary history. And it's only, as we now see, over the past few centuries that the modern state has taken shape, forging new political, economic, and social institutions, making it so powerful. And, likewise, states have all but eradicated most competitors for power and laid claim, as you look at the globe, to all corners of the earth, and as I was even noting earlier on, to things outside of the earth. However, all of these states are not homogeneous, meaning they're very different. So if you take a look at Russia, that is a state, and it is definitely in the same kind of category of a state as, say, the United States, but they're also fundamentally different things. And so we have to understand, okay, what explains these differences? Why are some powerful? Why are some weak? Why are some effective? Why are some ineffective? Why are some prosperous or rich? Why are some not prosperous or poor? Why are some stables while others appear to be disorganized? And to answer that question, we have to look at things like legitimacy. And legitimacy is the first value we really want to take a look at to explain value. And this shouldn't surprise you given Weber's definition that we've already looked at. So legitimacy is the value whereby something or something is recognized and accepted as right and proper. And here, even in our picture, you're going to see an old East Germany photo where East Germany is asserting its authority. And so somebody in this kind of great graffiti is like, East Germany doesn't have any legitimacy. We're going to see that Germany is actually split between two Germanys following World War II. One is going to have a big level of legitimacy, the other is not. Why? Why does East Germany lack legitimacy? Why does it not have this right and proper understanding? And so what we're trying to get at here is not necessarily legitimate in the sense of can we normatively justify it, but rather what we're trying to ask is why do the people who are in this context, why do they either find it legitimate or not legitimate? So why do sometimes people see the state, or one particular state, as rightfully having a monopoly on violence and the ability to employ it, and others do not? And once again, to answer this question, we're going to need to come back to Max Weber. Max Weber is going to argue that political legitimacy really comes in three basic forms: traditional, charismatic, and legal rational. Now, traditional, or what he's going to call the eternal yesterdays, or the unimaginably ancient recognition of authority, is going to rest on the idea that something's valid because it has always been that way. So in other words, this kind of traditional legitimacy is built on accepted forms of long use. It is embodied in historical myth. It is the rituals and the ceremonies that reinforce traditional legitimacy. It's about history and continuity. And so you accept this because it goes back so far that you can't even remember when you could not accept it. Now, what this means is traditional legitimacy is based on old things. A great example of this is the United Kingdom, the monarch, Queen Elizabeth. Why have a queen? The queen doesn't have any kind of real power in modern United Kingdom. Because the legitimacy of the state is that they have a monarchy. It's this tradition that goes back to the Middle Ages. The second kind of legitimacy that Weber is going to identify is something called charismatic legitimacy, or the gift of grace, or this absolutely personal devotion and personal confidence in some kind of singular charisma, the charisma of a single individual. And so rather history or continuity like the traditional form, charismatic legitimacy is based on the grace of one person with a certain magnetism who binds people to them and what they say and to what they follow. They're a hero. A great example of this would be somebody like Moses, the seemingly supernatural character who binds the people and creates an identity with himself. Others are going to point to somebody like, say, Hitler, right? Because again, keep in mind, it doesn't have to be that people are following him because they love him, but rather it's the magnetism, okay? Finally, there's legal rational. This is the one that most of you are going to be more familiar with. This is competency based on rationally created rules. So it's not rituals, it's not the charisma of individuals, but rather the assumption that a system of laws and procedures are highly institutionalized and that we accept these as reasonable. And so in this type of system, it's not the individual that is important, but rather it's the decisions being predictable and reasonable. And so you might, in this case, point to someone like an elected official, like former President Bush or President Obama. Now there's another mechanism in which we compare states, and that is strong and weak, capacity and autonomy. And I really want to make sure we get a few of these down. Strong and weak states. Strong states can easily fulfill their tasks. They can defend their territory, enforce all their rules, collect taxes, just to name a few important aspects. But weak states are not able to and do this as well. Rules are going to be applied haphazardly, if at all. Tax evasion, other kinds of things are going to be easy, and non-compliance in laws is going to be often. State officers themselves are going to have little faith. There'll be open corruption. So you have strong states don't have these things, weak states do have these things. And if you get weak enough, we're eventually going to call you a failed state, because a failed state is a state where the structures have become so weak they have basically completely collapsed and there really is no state power whatsoever. A great example of this would be Afghanistan prior to 2001. Now, capacity is the ability of the state to wield power in order to carry out basic tasks about trying to provide security and reconcile ideas of regimeness like freedom and equality. And finally, the last one we take a look at is autonomy. Autonomy is the ability of the state to wield its power independently of the public. So an autonomous state can carry out policy or action without consulting the public. So you'd say in the United States, we have a relatively not autonomous country because, right, it requires voting and some kind connection. A dictatorship would be very autonomous because the dictator can do the things that he or she wants to outside of the will, if you will, of kind of the collective masses of people. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is comparing states along a centralized or decentralized version. A centralized vision of a state is what we call unitary, and a decentralized is something called federal. And this is where a picture kind of speaks 1,000 words. A unitary state is one where a central government has power, and it may or may not, but it can give power down and out to states or to sub-governmental units. But it's the national government, the big thing, that's going to have all state power. This is going to flow down. Most states are going to behave this way. The United Kingdom, for instance, Parliament is sovereign. There are sub-governmental units, but these sub-governmental units only have power because Parliament allows them to have power. What you all are more used to is a federal or a decentralized version of state power, where there's a sharing of power between local governments and a national government. So state power is diffused across these institutions. Now, this is going to be a big deal, and I've thrown a lot of things out at you here, and I really encourage you, make sure you're doing your reading, because this is going to help you understand what we're talking about here about states and the way we can think about and measure states. I hope you have a fantastic day.